I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that the University of Melbourne is on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who have been custodians of this land for thousands of years, and I acknowledge and pay respects to their elders past and present. And I'd like especially to welcome Indigenous participants to this event who could be from many different lands across Australia and indeed across the world. This is the fourth in a series of seminars hosted by the Hallmark Affordable Housing Initiative at the University of Melbourne. A considerable number of migrants from the Horn of Africa reside in public housing estates in inner Melbourne suburbs. These communities' resettlement in Australia has been marked by inequalities and marginalisation. These conditions, combined with migrants' previous experiences of forced displacement and war trauma, have negatively impacted their livelihood and financial conditions, limiting their housing alternatives. Thus, public housing estates have become a common ground for the reconstruction of lives, communities, and the sense of home in conditions of precarity and exclusion. This seminar will draw upon insights captured by researchers in interviews with public housing residents in Melbourne. Panellists will discuss perceptions of how public housing has become the incubator for integration into Australian society, and how residential constraints and aspirations for future housing shape the experiences of the informants. The seminar will also introduce first-hand perceptions from a community leader and from an international expert's perspective on international migration and refugee studies. So our speakers are Dr. Sandra Carrasco-Mansilla, Dr. James Cheney, Dr. Margie Fala, and Mr. Tuelda Cadena. And so each of them is going to speak in turn, and I'll introduce each one of them as before they start. And just to, and at the end we will have a Q&A discussion. So if you have any questions to which you'd like discussed at the end of the seminar, please use the Q&A function on the screen. All right, so our first speaker is Dr. Sandra Carrasco-Mansilla. Sandra Carrasco is a research fellow and teaching assistant at the University of Melbourne in Australia. Sandra was awarded the Mackenzie Postdoctoral Fellowship from 2017 to 2020 at the University of Melbourne. She holds Master's and PhD degrees in Environmental Management from Kyoto University in Japan, and a Bachelor's degree in Architecture and Urbanism from St. Augustine National University in Peru. And currently she is enrolled in the Graduate Diploma in Education at Victoria University in Melbourne. Sandra's research interests include post-disaster reconstruction and community resilience, incremental housing, informal settlements, governance and city planning, social housing and migrant and refugee studies. Sandra has 17 academic publications in academic journals, book chapters and conference proceedings. Her teaching experience covers subjects in environment, architecture, construction and urban studies, delivered in English, Spanish and Japanese. She has working experience in government, academic and non-profit sectors in Australia, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Philippines and Peru. So welcome, Sandra.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Today's presentation is the ongoing project we are conducting with a wonderful team for almost 2 years. And we are exploring the experiences and the challenges for the residents of public housing. We are targeting the African communities and within them the people from the Horn of Africa. So So first of all, I would like to know why this study, what are our project matters here. In the recent weeks and months, we experienced an unprecedented emergency that we all know and we are all suffering. But that together with the challenges that this pandemic has been for all of us, we also presented an evidence some of the issues that we knew it was happening in our cities, but it was not as evident as it is now. As we've seen in the pictures, there is the story of two cities that live together but don't coexist. Those two cities that mutually exclude each other. What is the Melbourne that is that it has a blooming real estate industry, and then we happen together with them and often invisible, the public housing states. The public housing has been the home for many refugees and migrants in the recent decades. And one of the groups that are the newer groups in the public housing are the African migrants. So, but then our project is since in the beginning, try to find out what are the possibilities and what could be the pathways for the people who are living in public housing to live and find a more stable accommodation in the private housing sector, ended up knowing the reasons that are behind the challenges that they face. So then we started defining a common ground, what means for them to rebuild their lives in Australia. We're starting from a background that stories and narratives of suffering, where trauma, dispossession, and discrimination was something common for all of them. But also after they were resettled in Australia, they are facing different challenges, but also how they are responding to these challenges, how they develop different levels of agency. And something that is also common, that is the hope for the future. And we think that understanding how they define the hope is how we can address the residential issues for these communities. While we were conducting our research, we realized that there are different approaches that we cannot replicate from other studies. We need to understand the culturally sensitive issues. That's why we divided in the perception of men and women, but also the perceptions of the first generation, the ones who arrived in Australia first as either migrants or refugees, but also their children that accompanied them, and they were raised here, and the children that were born here and this is they are Australians culturally, but also they live in the middle of these two worlds. So we started trying to understand what are the issues that the first generation of women have. We understand that there's the common issues of trauma, lack of education and training. Something that is interesting that the first residential experiences they have were related to public housing. And in many cases, that's the only experience that they had in Australia. Many of them have caring responsibilities. And as we surprisingly, we observe that there are many separated or divorced women that they are living alone together with their children. But also together with this, we've seen that there are more opportunities for them in comparison to their home countries, where there are some removed stigmas. And one of the stigma that has been removed from them is the stigma of being a single women for their societies. Then we have seen determination. We have seen that we've seen entrepreneurs within the community that despite that they are facing challenges to live in terms of gender and also lack of working opportunities, they are investing in the future, and for them, the future is their children, even as a pathway to leave the public housing. For men, we have seen that the pressures of traditional roles have been played a very important role in the process of adaptation and the possibilities to leave the public housing. We've seen that they are aware of the risk of dependency in terms of Centrelink or government-supported government assistance. There's a lack of education and training that also prevents them to what they call fulfill to their traditional roles as the providers for the families. They perceive clearly these issues of trauma and segregation and isolation in Australia. But also they also perceive the risk that tenure security can have for them, because having the security to live in public housing in the end prevents them to leave, and we documented cases that they left public housing and they return. And this is particularly important for them because it prevents also to be fully functional elements in the Australian society. But also the opinion of the young, and when we see that the other issues that emerge from in the older generations that are related to limited opportunities that don't apply to them, but they're also facing other challenges as like the lack of sense of belonging. Discrimination, it is still there, but also the segregation. So we're talking about these areas, we talk about physical segregation, urban segregation to defend the rest of the city. They experience by themselves the stigma that's associated to living in public housing, but also they acknowledge that they can, the advantages to sharing the experiences and values within the community. So, and for the men, for the young men, they have also similar attitudes, but also on top of that, they are the ones who are more prone to be involved in the underserved activities. Their resistance also we've seen since in their conflict trying to fulfill their gender roles. The resistance to apply for public housing, as they already observed that this could be a trap for them that would prevent them to develop independently. But also we perceive from them that talking with people from their community and working with people, understanding their experiences and how they could overcome their issues plays a major role, as we've seen in this image. So this is an advertisement from that we found in the North Melbourne Mosque, where people want to meet, want to get advice, want to be mentored by people like themselves, look like themselves. So from here, we have different messages from the community that are prevent them from living in public housing. There are lacks of opportunities and skills accreditation. There are income and job insecurities. There are tenure security versus the risky private rental sector. That is how they perceive it. There is a risk of perpetuating the poverty and vulnerability. There is misinformation about housing opportunities. None of them knew that, according to the Victoria's Housing Commission, they have the possibility to buy a unit within the public housing, but also they know that the conventional mechanisms to get to fund their to buy a house cannot apply for them. There are strong religious and personal values that prevent them to be involved on loans and on paying interest. There is when they try the many attempts that they try to go to the private sector. So they face, most of them, rental discrimination. Interestingly, not because of their the ethnic backgrounds, but mostly because they have large families. They are invisible homelessness. Again, there is something that surprises us when there is the couples of the family divorces. The man is normally the one who leaves, and the one who is in risk of homeless to be homeless. And there is definitely social exclusion and urban segregation. So the experience of this COVID-19 also gave us some hints about how we could look forward. So we've seen that it's more evident than before that there are lack of channels for communication, information, and community engagement. We need to acknowledge the people's capacities and missing opportunities. They are not just passive recipients of help. There is urgent to create proactive communities and to avoid dependency, to promote participative planning to address social exclusion and urban segregation, to acknowledge the local networks and local leadership, and also to work towards planning for gender responsive development for these communities. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. James P. Cheney. Jim, as he told us to call him, is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Studies and Human Geography at Middle Tennessee State University. So thanks, Jim, for joining us today. It's evening in your time, and so thanks for taking some time out from your family to join us. Jim's research focuses on migration, refugee settlement, resettlement, and ethnic geographies, and he has conducted extensive field work on transnational immigrant communities in Mexico, Honduras, and Nicaragua. His co-authored book, Hispanic and Latino New Orleans, Immigration and Identity Since the 18th Century, was the recipient of the John Brinkerhoff Jackson Book Prize in 2016. Jim is currently involved in a project that explores the sense of place and integration of immigrants and refugees in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Sandra, for getting this started. It's an honor to be part of this seminar and get to talk about my research and comparing it and contrasting it, of course, being in the United States, to what is going on in Australia with a similar demographic. My research, again, focuses on geographies of immigrants and refugees in what we call the American South, the southeastern part of the United States. And since my my scholarly interest and my discipline is a little bit different than others on this panel, I thought I would just mention what I do as a cultural geographer. My work itself explores the diverse ways in which immigrants and refugee groups have shaped and reshaped particular places and cultural landscapes in the U.S. South. Considering both historical and contemporary factors, my research focuses on how race and ethnicity affect the incorporation and integration of specific ethnic groups and immigrant groups. More specifically, as a geographer, I'm interested, and this is what comes into play working with Somalis in Nashville, Tennessee, in push and pull factors in transnational migration. So I want to understand the push-pull factors behind why certain groups immigrate and the transnational linkages that they form or maintain back with their sending communities or where they've come from. I'm also interested in the residential patterns and sense of place of different ethnic groups and looking at how through their ideology, social organization, and social institutions, how that reflects both the local and regional processes of placemaking and such. So simply put, making a home in your new community. And finally, and I think this is extremely important, piggybacking off of some of the things that Sandra mentioned, I'm interested in the multitude of sociocultural, racial, and structural forces that shape the identities of immigrants and refugees, and more precisely, their children. So the subsequent generations, 1.5, second, and third generations, and how individuals negotiate their identities vis-a-vis their host societies where they live, and even their own ethnic communities. Since my research is in a different part of the world, literally, I thought I need to give a little bit of a background of what I do and why it's important, and then maybe how it fits in globally, at least on a larger scale, intellectually and academically. As mentioned before, I do research in the American South, in particular in Nashville, Tennessee. And Nashville is an interesting city if you're familiar with anything of the United States. It's oftentimes considered a quintessential American city, and I use that term very loosely because I don't exactly buy into that, but it's a city that historically and culturally has made a big imprint in American culture. It is the home of country music. It is also considered the buckle of the Bible Belt. It's the evangelical religious center of the United States. It's prominent in the country's history, both in the Civil War, politically as well. What it is not, compared to other U.S. cities, is it is a non-traditional immigrant destination, meaning that at least historically it was looked at as a place where immigrants didn't come, compared to San Francisco, Chicago, or New York. So the arrival of immigrants and refugees to Nashville has been challenging for some in different ways. Diversity itself was looked at historically through a black-white binary. You were either black or white. And so the arrivals of people from, say, Kurdish immigrants or refugees, from Africa, from Latin America, it's actually kind of turned things upside down for both the government and society in different ways of knowing how to accept and integrate people of different backgrounds. Nashville did emerge, though, as a refugee resettlement destination in the 1970s with the arrival of Kurds and also Laotian populations from Southeast Asia. And beginning in the 1990s, there was an economic boom in cities like Atlanta, Nashville, and Charlotte in the United States. And it attracts and continues to attract a steady flow of voluntary immigrants, that's economic immigrants, in particular from Latin America. With all that said, is that Nashville now is a cultural mosaic. It's kind of a microcosm of the rest of the world. We have a 13% foreign-born population, which kind of hides the fact that you have subsequent generations in the city. 140 different languages are now spoken in the city, a metropolitan area of 2 million people, so not a huge city. It is known as Kurdistan, Little Kurdistan, because it has the largest Kurdish population in the US, one of the biggest Laotian populations in the US, and more than 1 out of 10 people is of Latino background in Nashville, and projected to be 1 out of 3 by 2040, which is pretty amazing. And it also has a burgeoning or growing Somali population, which is what I wanted to talk about today. Of course, those ideas talking about this has brought on this just changing demographic in the city, misconceptions and real concerns about integration, whether that's about affecting the so-called American culture here, challenges to the English language, gang violence among refugee youth, and so forth. A lot of these concerns are just misconceptions. However, part of what my research that I'm interested in is things that are of concern both to the city government as well as local population, looking at the Somali refugee community. This study is looking at how Somalis, or what I'm interested in, is the Somali residential pattern in the city. And interestingly enough, how I came to study this was working with Catholic Charities, who is an organization in the United States that is responsible for resettling refugees. And Catholic Charities in Nashville and their headquarters here in Tennessee done a really good job of bringing different groups into the city and helping them settle and then helping them integrate into the host community or the larger population. That usually goes with helping them find an apartment complex, giving them an allowance to pay for an apartment for about a year, helping them to get a job. And eventually immigrants, once they kind of settle, or refugees, once they settle, begin to integrate into society. Somalis, on the other hand, are not doing that, at least in the last 25 years since they started to arrive in Nashville. In fact, quite the opposite. Something that is known in migration studies is spatial assimilation theory, or residential assimilation theory, sometimes it's called, suggests that as an immigrant arrives, they'll live in an ethnic enclave or around other co-ethnics, and as they learn the language, kind of get established, get their feet on the ground, then they will begin to move into other parts of the city and such when they make socioeconomic gains. What we're finding with Somalis in Nashville, it was actually quite the opposite. So kind of different than what you may find in Melbourne, is that this situation here was that instead of being put into public houses, Somalis were choosing to self-cluster residentially and such. And low home ownership also was something that was noticed by Catholic Charities. So they asked me to work on this project. So my research looked at why this was going on, if this was a cultural reason, economic reasons, and if so, what was behind it and such. Looking at the city, just really quickly at these maps, these are maps from our US Census and comparing where Somalis live in the city. And if you notice in the 2000, you have 3 different areas in the city. And if you can see, there's really can't tell here, the numbers that I have inside these 3 major clusters right here are the apartment complexes that the Somalis were moved into by Catholic Charities. This is actually a better map to look at. This is looking at the 2010 census, a map of Nashville, southeastern Nashville. And this is looking at the different locations of where Somalis were moved to. If you look at where number 1 is, those were apartment complexes that were specifically spread out in the city to help with the idea behind Catholic Charities is to help Somalis begin to integrate. What was happening is that, well, compared to other groups, what was happening is that after a year or 2, other refugees would begin to spread across the city and by homes. Somalis, on the other hand, were actually self-clustering into a certain area of town. And because of that, what you had is ethnic businesses forming in these areas, a residential pattern of clustering, and what Catholic Charities was worried about, as well as Nashville's government, the idea of perpetual renters, people that were never in the idea of the American dream, is that eventually that you own property and have equity. So my research was looking into why exactly that was happening, actually going back to this slide. And I was interested in, the cultural reasons of what usually is argued is that immigrant groups, according to spatial assimilation theory, that first generation immigrants will always cluster together residentially, social capital, safety in number, understanding language, just cultural familiarity. What happened is that when I started studying Somalis, I was also interested to see if there was racism and discrimination. That was my first go-to when I started researching. I did this through focus groups and qualitative research. And I found that it was actually not the truth at all, that in fact, Somalis felt that they were not discriminated at all in Nashville, but the reasons behind this were, yes, for cultural reasons, but also a religious view of Western banking practices, the idea of riba in Islam, or the idea of interest. And that was looked at as haram or as forbidden. And so you have a very conservative Somali population in Nashville that looked at taking any kind of loan or interest rate as technically a sin. And so because of that, they were going to forego home ownership and decided to cluster in certain areas in certain apartment complexes for that reason. And of course, then comes transportation needs and convenience to these economic businesses. The same thing is with home ownership, is owning a car. Usually in the United States, unless you save for years to buy a car, you have to take out a loan. And so it's kind of interesting to see these cultural practices impacting the residential pattern of Somalis in Nashville, which is something that hadn't been looked at with different immigrant and refugee groups in the United States in the past, particularly from the Horn of Africa or Eastern Africa. So my research is looking at some of the businesses that have formed up and kind of like taking buildings that already exist, repurposing them and such. And I do want to point down one of interest to me down here is growing up in Nashville. I was aware of this business down here in the right-hand corner of my slide. This used to be what we call in the United States a roadhouse. I think it has a different meaning in Australia, but it's kind of a dive bar, a country bar for bands. And it went out of business. Somali community bought it and turned it into a mosque. So kind of changing the cultural landscape of the city in an interesting way. Just in closing, some of the findings from this study that I was interested in and that was interested in the city, and I share with Catholic Charities and also the city government here in Nashville, is long-term concerns about this idea to resist or not want to participate in Western banking practices for buying homes. And this is something in interviews over and over came up, that if it comes between choosing what I believe in my religion to owning a home, I'm going to choose my religion and stay in an apartment. It was something that in all my focus groups came up. The long-term consequences in immigrant community of perpetual renters. It also limits business opportunities and expansion, because again, the United States, I'm assuming in Australia too, that unless you can take out loans, you're pretty limited in what you can do business-wise. Isolation from the larger Nashville business community for businesses itself, but also socially for the community. And that for that reason impacts integration, particularly residential. And then what also came out in for maybe a different conversation is discrimination within the Somali community, where things were based on, clan identity and such, of which exactly apartments that you live in. And then again, reaching out of what to do for the city, of why it was interested in them, is to begin providing workshops and consultations on financial literacy and different ways that are more Shia compliant for this particular population. Guidance Residential is one of the organizations in the United States I've recommended that does work on Shia compliant lending and such. So these are some of the things that I think is interesting in the United States that maybe that is worth juxtaposing with what's going on in Melbourne and Australia. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dr. Majdi Falla. Majdi is a Tunisian architect who's recently finished his postdoctoral research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as an Aga Khan postdoctoral fellow. He is a teaching assistant and researcher at the University of Western Australia. Majdi has taught architectural history and theory, urban planning and design at the Melbourne School of Design as a senior lecturer and studio leader, and at Deakin University for 2 years, and at the University of Western Australia for 6 years. He has also worked as a research assistant at the University of Adelaide. As an architect and architectural historian, Majdi's scholarly interests and research projects include architecture and globalization, planning global cities, traditional architecture, Islamic, colonial and post-colonial, ethics and aesthetics, social justice and public housing, and interactive design. Majdi has published in several international journals and is currently a reviewer for Urban Design International and with Journal of Heritage Management. Majdi, thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for having me. Just a small correction. I was working as a senior teaching assistant at Melbourne University, not senior lecturer. So thank you for the presentation. So I guess you can see my screen. So I've been involved in this project for the past 2 years with Sandra and an amazing team, looking at the experience of African migrants from the Horn of Africa, specifically in Melbourne's public housing estates, and really asking the most important questions on how to move forward, how to understand the stories, the concerns, especially now with COVID-19 happening around the globe, of these communities, and how to suggest alternatives for a better, let's say, a better picture of public housing, better spatial configurations. So in today's presentation, I'll go a little bit back in history and talk a bit about public housing estates. So public housing estates around the world, started to emerge since first public housing estates in London, 19th century, and they've been home to very vulnerable communities. So typically, we find refugees and immigrants. So these are the most, or among the most or the hardest hit by social economic challenges as they move from their, land their original lands, or from their home countries, or the land of transition, a second country or third country, to the new land, let's say. So they, this includes challenges of finding affordable housing. And by 2025, an estimated 1/3 of the world's city dwellers will struggle to secure decent affordable housing. So now I'm gonna go next slide. All right. So one of the first questions I'll be asking two main questions: the challenges of public housing and the spatial dimension. And the question is, how can public housing be made better? So as we started this study back in 2018, we did a comparison, a brief comparison of the French government HLM, habitation à loyer modéré, which means rent-controlled housing, which you find typically in the suburbs of French cities, major French cities, Saint-Denis, around Paris, etc. So in 2018, the French government and its Ministry of Territorial Cohesion suggested a plan to generate funds to build and renovate this housing. There are questions nowadays, and you see some of these being even bulldozed on my last trip to Paris. I've seen some of these being torn down, and there are questions nowadays in France on whether this should be the move or not, or whether these type of structures should be reconsidered. So the monumental scale of Melbourne's, which you can see on the right-hand side, Melbourne's largest estates, is intimidating for visitors. finding one's way to a particular address can be also challenged, and buildings take the same form. They lack individual identity. Identity is an important feature for people, indigenous people, migrants, refugees. And the scale of these buildings and the dull colors. So if we look at the scale of Melbourne's public housing estates, and even the textures on the facades, coupled with a very repetitive gridded network of windows, are a reminder of we described it in one of our papers, a Soviet era, that never existed in Melbourne. One can see similar layouts, colors, and materials on the facades of HLM, Saint Denis. So you can see there is, if you compare both buildings in terms of colors, textures, facade, grids, you can see a stark similarity between both. And this speaks really to the ubiquity of public housing design around the world. So this is one of the questions I'm asking: how can we make public housing better? So public housing estates often have pronounced and cultural social mix, people coming from all over the world as refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants, with first-generation migrants and refugees across the globe living as neighbors. So this can have benefits including cultural exchange, mutual understanding, but can also trigger social withdrawal and isolation. The risks for these people are high. So people from new cultural groups arrive in neighborhoods, living in these towers, in these buildings. And the question is whether they connect to these spaces. Do they actually connect to these spaces? Are these spaces suitable for their living or their lived experiences? What is being offered as places for people to connect with their new community in and around public housing meets few people's needs and or expectations. So if we look at next slide, for example, evaluation of the interior spaces, such as these long interior corridors, 1.5 meters with blank walls, do not necessarily provide the comfort, communication, and interaction between tenants. The exterior spaces delineate rather than join up the communities of public and private housing. So there are fences in between, etc. There is stark difference between the public and private housing in this area. So these dimensions of Melbourne's public housing may set up spatial tension that mirrors the occupants' lives. Yet they could also offer an opportunity to be canvas for new interpretation or rethinking of architecture, whether we should stop constructing these type of buildings or whether we should rethink the architecture and the urban development of these public housing estates. German, outside an example here, sociologist Martina Loh, who works on the social dimension of space, or in her book, Sociology of Space, Material, Social Structures, and Actions, she focuses on the emergence of space as a result of interplay between social structure, material world of objects and bodies, and symbolism within that social world. So the new interpretation, as we suggest, needs to reflect the lives and experiences of refugees, migrants, making new home, as well as more established members of the community. This reminds me of one of the interviews one of the discussions we had with one of the ladies, the tenants of public housing estates, and she narrates her story living back home in a house, and spending nights with family on the roof of the house, looking at the stars, etc. An experience that is, of course, is not possible here in Melbourne's public housing estates. Now, last part of the presentation, and you see the names on the left-hand side of tenants. We interviewed people who live in public housing estates. So why is this narrative important? Why do stories matter? Why do the stories of migrants and refugees, public housing estates matter? So if we look at studies of forced migration refugees, we find that these studies focus on policies and the politics behind the complex concept. So the scope of refugee studies has been generally limited by an overemphasis on policy, leaving behind dichotomy between the lost home and the new home. How can we balance the lost home, the identity of the lost home, and the new home we live in? There is somehow a tendency to focus on the negative experience, the sad events, the struggles, the war, that comes with the forced migration and unescapable transition that pushed refugees and migrants, including the stories of our forthcoming book on the 14 characters who left their home or fled their home countries in the Horn of Africa. Now, in understanding of, to conclude, understanding of these stories, in particular African migrants and refugees, is central to the appreciation of how their journey from the homeland to the new land has affected their perception of home, their appreciation of what they left behind, and their continuous efforts to build on legacy carried across countries and oceans. And what can they bring from home? What elements can they bring in terms of this spatial dimension, configuration of space, visual culture, etc.? What can they bring to the new home? So this same legacy has been the drive, motivation, the stories we worked on, the stories of African migrants and refugees from the Horn of Africa who settled in Melbourne. So each story matters, and each story can be an inspiration for architects, designers, urban designers to reconfigure spaces that accommodate people's identities, cultures, and then spaces that are welcoming to migrants and refugees. Thank you for your attention.
So our fourth presenter this morning is Mr. Tuelda Cadena. Tuelda is the chairman of the Melbourne Eritrean United Community. He has worked with community organisations supporting the Eritrean community for many years before he arrived in Australia. Upon his arrival here, Tuelda chaired the Eritrean Workers' Union between 1989 and 1992. He combined his community work with various roles in transportation and postal service companies. He is recently involved with different non-profit organisations such as Eritrean Relief, Caritas, and is collaborating with the Carlton Neighbourhood Learning Centre.
Thank you for everyone. Yeah, well, most of the things was done by Dr. Sandra. She's wonderful. I met Sandra at the Melbourne University. I've mentioned it before, Paul. I was involved with the Eritrean community for years, doing volunteer and helping my community, and also in general with the Australian society. So the most research we done was at the high-rise in Carlton. Last year, we started to research about the standard of living of the community in Carlton. In Carlton, we have, at the high rising, we have about 9 groups from the Horn of Africa. These groups from Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia, different group, Eritrea, different group, Sudan, and Djibouti. In this area, you can tell there is a lot of well, problems or what we call it, perceptions, we call it, because it's a new arrival. When we just let them into this country with the open hand, they're so happy. But what happening was with their experience, with their living, like most of them, they live in cottage or live in open area. When they put them in that building, in the high-rising building, I introduced some people. I mean, it'd be hard for them, especially for a couple years, they can't make it. And also there is crowded of the housing, 8-7 kids in 2 bedrooms. So there's a lot of crowded up there. And also the jobless and also homeless we have. And also unsafe ground. You can see a lot of bottles on the ground, a lot of needles on the ground. And also lack of activities for the young people up there. Became like, I mean, like they don't have a place. They don't have. We didn't create anything. We didn't create things for them. We didn't provide them. So what happened is sometimes it became like a ghetto. During night time, this young kid, this teenager, go downstairs and just making noise, and a lot of things happening. So this is due to the lack of housing. If you got a house, a separate area, or they go separate place, they're not going to be like that. So, and at the same time, they're not integrating. So by doing this, we're not helping the community because it's lack of integration, I can say. Also, we have that single woman's problem. The activities are there too. The lack of public halls for their birthdays and the other activities. So there is a lot of things to tell, a lot of stories to tell. For many people, they have a lot of problems. So the only solution for this is, I think, to build new houses. As you know, in Australia, in Melbourne, the waiting list for the house is about 10 years or more. So that thing is not solved for years. We're speaking a lot of times, we raise this question, but nobody's answering. So I mean, like, Australia is a wonderful country, as we know, but the only problem we have is also to build a community, to build a strong, healthy society, and to build a bridge between them, and to have them, to welcome them. So there is, I mean, we don't want to see any like perceptions. On that day, I was working with the COVID-19. We just want to test. We just educate people to test. And one woman told me, I don't want to test because they're going to take my DNA. That's, I mean, like, this is this perception that we could avoid it by educate the family, educate the people, educate the community. So in generally, I met Dr. Sandra, is a wonderful and hard work woman, and she's done a great job with the community. And that's all my story is. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for organizing this event. Thank you very much.
I'll start with a question from Megan Murray. It's a question relating to Sandra's presentation. What can we do to change the perception of social housing to make tenure more supportive and desirable among migrant groups, be it design or community-related initiatives? So how can we change perceptions on social housing?
Thank you very much. I think that we were already exploring this question and in some discussions we had before. So I have to say that it's both. It has to be a coordinated initiatives that could address the community disadvantages, but also promote the community representation in the broader society. We've seen such an enormous social capital here, a lot of motivation to be involved, fully involved in the Australian society, but we've seen that there are lack of opportunities. And we've seen that the people don't want to be seen as passive recipients of help. They want to do things on their own, and they are doing things already. Then promoting empathy and interaction. We've seen that they are also spatially segregated in the city. We've seen that even though the public housing states are visible in our cityscape, but they're invisible and as they are neglected areas. We've seen that there's lack of permeability for them to, not only for the people to feel safer outside of in the transition to the outside of the public housing states, but also promoting interaction with the rest of the neighbors in the surrounding areas. So I think that would be the starting point to promote these changes in the perception, how we see the public housing, and to learn from them and to know them, but also them to know the rest of us.
All right. I wonder also if I could ask Majdi to maybe comment on design issues, because you raised design in your presentation. Do you think there are changes that can be made to public housing in Melbourne that can either change perceptions of these disadvantaged communities themselves, or to change perceptions of those communities from outside? I mean, you know, there was certainly the perceptions of those housing estates were very much at stake, and the public, very public lockdowns that the state government made of those housing estates maybe 6 weeks ago now.
I mean, in terms of design, these dates back to 1950s, these public housing estates, some of them. I mean, the most radical scenario would be to start from scratch and tear these buildings down and restart. But in terms of redesigning spaces, I believe that there needs to be more sensitive to, you know, the cultural dimension of gathering, of you know, welcoming these refugees who come from hardships, from hard experiences. So in terms of the width of corridors, for example, spaces that engage people rather than long spaces that do not engage this type of communication. We also noticed that spaces are not adaptable to the number of people, or not adapted to the number of people who live in one household. So a really number of rooms was not enough. You had kids, 3 or 4 kids sleeping in the same room in some instances. So these are questions probably the local authorities need to address, you know, in discussions or close discussion with the communities in workshop, etc. I mean, I don't think there was back in the time when there were built enough public consultation or workshops with communities or with refugees. Probably that's something that you know, local government can work on if there are plans to. I mean, the scale is what strikes me more. So really managing that scale, reducing that scale. I don't know what that means on the ground. I mean, reducing that scale, making it more you know, you know, suitable to the human dimension rather than towers of 9 or 10 floors, which come with lots of issues based on our discussions, you know, social issues, problems with, you know, social problems, etc.
I think Sandra has something to add.
Yes, so I forgot to mention this. So we've seen in one of the public housing in Carlton that there was an interesting kind of experiment, but because they were building private housing buildings there. And when we talk with the people, if they interact, they've seen that there is no real ground for them to interact as adults. But surprisingly, not really surprisingly, interestingly, the children are the ones who start interacting. So then they make us thinking that creating probably engaging or, you know, public spaces for interaction could help in this sense. We are seeing that probably these are the spaces we talk about at the short term and what could be possible at the moment without really changing the whole design of the buildings, that we've seen this much more rigid. Working in the public spaces would make a big change to promote the interaction with different people. We've seen that the public spaces where, because of the children, also the mothers interact, the women interact. We've seen that there are in Carlton, there are some areas that are for cyclists where there also there's certain levels of permeability, and we've seen already some hints at how this could be used for promoting this this interaction with the whole community.
Okay, thanks, Sandra. So here's a question for Jim. What are the levels of incorporation and cultural citizenship between non-Somalian African migrants or refugees in Nashville and Somalian refugees or migrants?
Well, I mean, definitely it varies by group. And I think, again, you know, why I think it's, you know, we want to generalize about refugees, that refugees follow this trajectory into integration or how they're incorporated. But I mean, it varies by group for different reasons. I think that, you know, if I had to make a comparison of the difference in what I've seen in my research in Nashville, is a comparable group would be Ethiopian immigrants in Nashville. There's somewhat cultural similarities, but it's also groups from Eritrea as well. The difference I think that I wanted to make of saying what you saw with Somalis in terms of home ownership and this residential clustering is if you compare it to other Muslim immigrants or refugees, is that their interpretation of riba or interest seems to vary by group. And one of the concerns that Catholic Charities had, working with these groups was that the Kurdish population had taken a different trajectory than the Somali population in Nashville, to where they were very integrated into the city. And when I use the term integration, I mean it socioeconomically, but also participation in government. The Kurdish community is very active in Nashville. They have festivals that are very open and invite the non-immigrant community to participate from an economic standpoint, following the idea of spatial assimilation. They have moved out into actually some of the wealthier suburbs of the city, and so kind of become more part, I guess you could say, of the larger Nashville community. It's not to say with Somalis that you don't see some of that, but what was interesting when talking to Somalis is the idea that moving out of this particular area in some cases was looked down upon. And there was some Somalis that had moved out of that particular area I was showing the city. And, when that was brought up sometimes in focus groups, there was opinions about that and such. So, looking at, the integration and again, simply put, classic assimilation theory, assumes that subsequent generations will eventually blend in to the mainstream. I do personally think that eventually that will happen because that's just what usually happens. But definitely with other groups that have worked in Nashville, particularly Latinos, the Kurdish population, the Laotian population, is Somalis seem to be a little bit slower in doing that. Again, and I want to bring up, I think it's interesting, comparing this with Melbourne is talking about structure and agency, it's very different, what I'm seeing, and that's when Sandra had approached me about their research. I was really intrigued by what I was reading because, looking at that integration and interaction between the larger Melbourne community and the refugee and immigrant community is different than what you see in the United States, kind of the factors involved in that and such.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. And now we have another question for Sandra. This is from Orlando. I would like you to clarify the relationship between African migrants and refugees, their social capital and public housing in Melbourne. How has the public housing shaped the level of integration and incorporation and their sense of cultural citizenship within Victoria and Australia? Well, that's a very big question. Perhaps you could just give us some snippets.
This is, I think, a very interesting question, but it's also a little bit outside of their scope. We are trying to look at. We've seen the statistical information that not all of migrants from the Horn of Africa live in inner Melbourne suburbs. In fact, most of the migrants from these countries live outside of the public housing. But what we are seeing here is like the members of this community that live in public housing face particular challenges, and in terms of how it created the sense of cultural citizenship. Even though the public housing is not where most of the community live, they became a very important places for them as a representation of their community. We heard from the people, from the residents, that in a special occasions, there are people from outside of the public housing that come and meet there because they know that there is a very strong community there where they can feel at home. And it's also something that we learn from them. So they feel at home, they feel safe, they feel free to be themselves, to follow their cultural values there, and in that sense, the public housing play a very important role. and with something that we've seen when in the first generation migrants and when in the first years. The problem here is that for most of the people, this an accommodation that's supposed to be a transition to integration became a long-term accommodation where they feel trapped. So we've seen residents living there about 20 or more than 20 years living there. They don't find ways to get out. And when we talk to them in a hypothetical scenarios, what would be the possibilities for you if you would be able? And we started with the idea that this strong sense of community would prevent them to leave, and we ended up with answers that say no. I mean, they say we would be happy to leave, and we could come back anytime. We know we are going to miss our network, our community, our people here, but we would be better somewhere else. That is one of the reasons that they feel trapped there, and they became isolated areas. We can call them ghettos, where they cannot live. They feel trapped there, and also that prevents them even to learn from the broader Australian society, even to improve the language skills. Many of them don't speak English, and they don't feel that they need to speak in English because the community is speaking their own language.
Okay, that's fascinating. So I think we next have a question for Tuelda. You mentioned that there is no dedicated shared space for young people in the housing estates. What would be a good change to improve young people's lives in public housing in Melbourne?
Yeah. Well, I think the best thing is just to have create some activities like sport, music, and so on. So what we see here in Carlton is there is space. Even me and Sandra, we spoke about that. There is a space to create that stuff if government willing to help. So by doing this, we can create a feature for the young generation, a health community, and also a strong community. So I mean, that is what I can say, because there is a space. If there is a fund, it can create a recreation program, and also it can have skill or some sort of activities for the young people. Instead of just having fun during the night, they can stay there, they can whatever, study or doing some activities, do some sports, and so on. I think that will be the best solution for the community.
Okay, thanks. Next, we have a question for Majdi. To what extent do you feel the perceived shortcomings of Australian public housing sites derive from the architecture of the buildings themselves, or from a broader underinvestment of public housing precincts? Underinvestment by consecutive governments. So I guess the issue is whether it's fundamentally the flaws are fundamentally design flaws, or fundamentally flaws in processes of managing public housing and improving it over time.
Thank you for the question. I'd say that it is both. So it is this less. I mean, there needs to be more investment in public housing, in talks with the local community, in drafting policies around the needs of these communities, as well as the architecture also matters. The architecture of the space. The architecture where people can contribute to the, to shaping that public space, where the public realm or the public domain outside responds to their needs as a community, to their events. Really, there are some, and I saw a question about whether we can cite some good examples of public housing estates. There are a few examples of good affordable housing estates around the world. So there is Quayside Village in in Canada, an interesting example where within that affordable housing, there is a communal space with kitchens, laundry, craft areas, a large courtyard. So really convivial space, interesting space for people to watch movies, to convene together and discuss. And this example in Canada, Quayside Village, all the houses are built from reused materials found on site. So, and they follow the principle of what I would term a human dimension. So these are 4 stories building, basically, with apartments on the upper floors, and then a courtyard, convivial spaces for residents on the to grow their food on the ground floor as well. So really having a discussion or an open discussion with the community, and we could get a sense that that discussion is absent on the ground when COVID hit and when there was a abrupt lockdown. So we interviewed some of the residents, public housing estates, and we get a sense from their statements that there is no this discussion dialogue is basically absent on the ground. So I believe it's both. It's working on the space and it's working on the communication, interaction with different members of communities, females, males, and even workshops for children to understand how these housing estates can be improved. And there are many examples around the world relating to the other question. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Majdi. This is an anonymous question. Do you see any potential strategies and/or precedent initiatives that seek to address the cultural aversion to debts and loan that prevent engagement in the private rental market and I guess indeed private ownership of housing? Anyone want to take that? Well, one of the things that struck me is maybe, thinking about the situation in Nashville, are there any community attempts to own housing collectively which would overcome individual aversion to indebtedness, for example?
That's actually a good question. One of the things, and this is something that I had asked Majdi and Sandra about in their research in Melbourne, is that there's a couple of things. There was the idea of actually renting apartments where you had larger extended families renting an apartment, pulling money together for car transportation and things like that. As far as homeownership, larger than a family, no. Another issue I thought was kind of interesting, again, kind of just looking at particular groups, and I think this would need to be followed up and compared with other studies with other Somali communities, is another argument that was made, at least in my focus groups, of why there wasn't a lot of home ownerships. And I thought this was a very interesting answer, and I heard this over and over again too, was that Somalis sometimes said they felt that they were tied down if you buy a house, and that they like the ability, and you do find a lot of secondary migration in the United States among Somali refugees, where they're moving between different cities, so cities that have large Somali communities. I was interested to know in Australia if they were more sedentary. And so, those different aspects, I think, impacted, even decision-making process of buying homes. I think, again, too, what I was recommending to the city was have more workshops on different mechanisms, lending mechanisms that were Sharia compliant. At least, the idea that Somalis would be like, okay, this is okay. We can do this if we use this banking system and such. I don't know if that exactly answers the question.
Well, it comes close. So thank you. Tuelda, are there initiatives in your Eritrean community to build financial competence amongst Eritreans to allow them to better better able to finance the things that they might want to do privately?
Well, in general speaking, I think when you do research about the Eritreans around here, well, they're able to, first of all, I think most of them looks like, in terms of integration, I can say they've done a good job. And also, when you interview people, research with Sandra out here, what we find out is there is not many Eritreans at the Housing Commission. Here in Carson, we got only 8 families out here. And what I can see is there is some improvement with our community, to be honest. And also we need to follow the other communities also to do the same thing. So we're hoping.
Okay, thanks. All right, this is to Sandra. It's quite a long question. So African refugees and migrants in Melbourne are stratified along regional and religious lines. South Sudanese, Eritreans, Somalians, and Footscray, Richmond and Victoria Street, and so on, and a good number of other migrants from West Africa, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, and Zimbabwe. How has their backgrounds and different origins influenced their level of integration?
Thank you very much. This is an interesting question that we tried to explore in the beginning on our first project when we were looking more at integration in terms of developing the sense of home. We cannot really compare what is the situation with other African groups because by then we just found one Nigerian resident living in Carlton's public housing. But that gave us an idea of how the diversity within, this region is extremely diverse, even just the Horn of Africa, and even just one of the countries there, even just Somalia has different tribes. We've seen that they belong to a certain tribe or another makes a big difference when we talk about levels of interaction, levels of where they promote the building of these connections or these networks within the community. But I think when people live here, and we've seen that they face common challenges, that is displacement, and they share the suffering and they feel connected by the suffering. So it is not something limited to refugees, it's something that also observed in disaster affected people when they were displaced, or with informal communities when they feel that they have common challenges and they find a need to be united, to feel together. Which, however, also, at least in case of informal settlers, when they find the way to formalize and have a better living conditions, there is a challenge that what before became a collective ideal, collective dreams, collective objectives become individual dreams, so or individual objectives that usually compete among each other. In that sense, I would say that at the moment, while they're living in public housing, they've seen united by this by the same issues that they face, like inequalities, the lack of working opportunities, and many others. They're definitely belonging to being Muslims or being Christian. That is like the 2 poles makes a big difference here, that they are somehow a little bit contested, but in the end there's also some attitude that again goes back to this idea of unity, that even in just talking about the Horn of Africa, many of the countries were in war against each other, and back there where probably not really good friends, but here they are, because they're sharing this suffering, and they feel that they need to somehow feel to stay together and feel part of the community. So yeah, that's probably something a little bit. How can I try to answer this question? That is really what we observe here with talking with the people.
Right. Next, we have a question from Ted Baillieu, and I should explain to Jim that Ted Baillieu is an important politician here in Melbourne. He was formerly Premier of the state. So Ted says, this is a seriously interesting presentation, and it needs to be more widely seen. His question is around the annual turnover of properties, I guess mostly rental properties we would be talking about, and the average tenure time of occupancy. And he asks, has the number of children and families been affected by housing shortcomings?
I mean, that's a tougher question. I mean, I can't give a straight yes or no. I can say this, that you do begin to see, for multiple reasons, I wouldn't just say because of housing, but just for the simple fact, just economic forces of talking to Somalis, the choice to have less children in some cases, but I don't think it's simply put because of that, or just simply because of that. What was happening, and when you have 25 years of a group in one particular area, you have, almost can do chronologically time out, and see what generations of how they're, integrating and such into a society. And what's happening that you can see with Somalis that arrived early on in the early 90s is, just simple economic forces of, having a car, paying rent and such. In the United States, it's an expensive, it's an expensive country, is, having smaller families makes it a little bit easier, but more than anything, gender dynamics are in play. And what's happened to, I think, that impacts the number of children, and I'll give an example here in just a second, that if this is a question, from what I understand, the decision about number of children has to do more with the fact that women in the United States of Somali background have more opportunities. What happens for Catholic Charities is when refugees arrive is that both men and women are employed. They help them seek out jobs. And because of that, now that you have two people in incomes coming in, decisions about having children are impacted for that. Another thing that was notable that I didn't mention in this presentation was another thing that I was looking at in my study is that women were getting married at a later age if they'd been in the United States for a period of time. And one of the things that was brought up over and over again with discussion with both men and women was the fact that women were saying, in Somalia, in a refugee camp, I didn't have many opportunities. I was expected to marry early. In the United States, I am given a job, I have an apartment, I can take care of myself, and I have more decisions and leeway and such. And several mothers would mention to me that they were pushing their children to go on to college and get an education, not to get married. And so all of these factors play in, I think, to decision-making about, sizes of family and such. Simply put, the more opportunities that this population had economically, socially, I think it helped in that aspect of like making decisions about family sizes and such.
Sandra, do you think that similar factors are play in Melbourne?
I believe yes. I believe that, just to get an insight from, we observed that there are big families in our sample, with almost more than 40% were of the households were about 6 to 9 members. But we also observe smaller size families, and we've seen that it has a lot to do with how the traditional roles of women are changing here. Starting from the fact that many of them, they came here first. They were considered the most vulnerable groups, so they were resettled first in Australia, and were the women that came with, sometimes alone or sometimes with the children, that sponsored their partners or their husbands. Transition that came to adapt to the lifestyles in Melbourne or in Australia in general, again, created a condition for relatively advantage for women, where, as I was mentioning, there were some stigmas that disappeared, that something that could be seen as a disabled, disability back in their home countries, but if they're single mothers. Here in Australia, it doesn't exist. Where they even, I mean, it might sound weird, but even when they find that there's no possibility to reconcile the stresses or the challenges for family unity here, and they decide to divorce. I mean, and men traditionally leave, so women feel sometimes even relieved, and they say, "Look, I have to pay less rent now, and I can invest that on my children." So that is something, I think interesting, that in the sense that how women empowerment can have an impact here in the way how they plan their families, and how they also is something that we've seen in all the women, that they are strongly investing on the future, not of themselves but of their children. So they do, they're more aware of that, and it's also something that worries more, not what is happening to them if they can access a housing somewhere else, or they can have more opportunities, but what they can do to create a good future for their children, and hopefully they can also be part of that bright future with the kids.
I want to agree with Sandra on that. I found almost the exact same thing, is that, the idea of stigma begins to disappear. And what you were finding is that a lot of Somali women that suddenly were living by themselves, they were working together, they would commute together, and over again, the idea was, simply put, and this is what I was said, I don't need a man. Why would I need a man? And it was something I found, very interesting, of talking about, like, gender dynamics and gender roles changing. But, it was an idea that suddenly, economically, had an advantage, could take care of themselves. I think that impacts, the relationship and such, about ideas about family, stigma, being able to live alone and not, being looked down upon and such in the community.
Well, look, thank you very much. We have more questions, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. So, look, I'd just like to thank our panelists this morning, Sandra Carrasco, James Cheney, Majdi Fala, and Tuelda Cadena. I think it's been a fascinating discussion, and I'd like to thank you all very much.